Captain Dennis Cambell of the Royal Navy pushed a wooden model across a table at the Admiralty in August 1951 and rotated the flight deck by roughly 8 degrees. The men watching him, engineers from the Naval Aircraft Department, officers from the Directorate of Naval Air Warfare, had spent the morning discussing a problem that had killed hundreds of pilots since 1945. A jet aircraft returning to a straight-deck carrier at 120 knots had one option if the arrestor wire snapped: crash into a barrier of steel cables or into the parked aircraft beyond it. Campbell's answer was to twist the landing area to port. A pilot who missed the wires could now open the throttle and go around. No barrier, no pile-up, no funeral at Lyon-Solent. The Royal Navy in 1951 was flying the Supermarine attacker off HMS Eagle, its first operational jet fighter, and the loss rate was becoming politically embarrassing. The Fleet Air Arm had suffered 97 fatal deck accidents between 1949 and 1951 alone, a figure the Admiralty Board discussed in closed session in November 1951. Rear Admiral Matthew Slattery, 5th Sea Lord for Aviation, wrote in an internal memorandum that the service was losing pilots faster than we can train them. The attacker's approach speed was 30 knots higher than the wartime Seafires. The margins had vanished. Campbell's sketch, refined with the naval scientist Lewis Boddington at the Royal Aircraft Establishment at Farnborough, was formally submitted to the Admiralty in November 1951. The proposal was elegant to the point of provocation. No new steel, no new hulls, no new budget line. Paint the deck differently, shift the arrestor gear, angle the landing strip between 6 and 10 degrees off the ship's centerline. The forward end of the deck, cleared of the barrier, could be used to park aircraft or ready them for launch. 2 operations at once. A carrier that could recover and prepare aircraft simultaneously at jet speeds without killing its own aviators. The Admiralty passed the proposal to the Americans within weeks. The relationship between the Royal Navy and the US Navy Bureau of Aeronautics had been close since the wartime Lend-Lease arrangements, and the two services exchanged technical papers understanding agreements dating from 1948. Campbell's paper reached Rear Admiral Apollo Susek in Washington in early 1952. The Americans were at that moment wrestling with the same problem in a more acute form. The USS Midway class was operating Grumman F-9F Panthers, and Volt F-7U Cutlasses were coming into service with landing characteristics that terrified their own pilots. The Bureau of Aeronautics had been designing an interim barrier system with elaborate hydraulics. Campbell's paper made the entire American research program redundant overnight. What followed was a rapid, almost embarrassed American response. The US Navy asked to trial the concept immediately. Painted lines were applied to the flight deck of USS Midway in May 1952 for touch-and-go trials. No actual landings, no new steel, just the angled markings and pilots pretending. The results were sufficiently persuasive that Vice Admiral John Ballantyne ordered a full conversion trial. The British, meanwhile, were preparing their own physical demonstration. HMS Triumph, a light fleet carrier, had her deck repainted with angled markings in February 1952, and became the first vessel in the world to conduct touch-and-go trials on an angled landing area. Cambell watched the aircraft come in from the island bridge. The attackers roared past the parked aircraft to port and vanished off the bow. Nothing hit anything. Nothing burned. The next question was whether steel would follow the paint. HMS Centaur received the first true angled deck in the Royal Navy in late 1954. But the technological revolution the British had triggered was already outpacing the country that had invented it. The Admiralty's ship department, headed by Sir Victor Shepherd, was operating under the crushing constraint of the 1952 Defence Review, which had capped naval construction spending and delayed the completion of the audacious class carriers. Britain had the idea, the prototype, the trials data, and roughly a third of the American budget with which to exploit it. The paradox was uncomfortable. The Royal Navy had solved the jet age's most dangerous problem, and could barely afford to install the solution on its own ships. The Americans moved with an urgency that startled Whitehall. USS Antietam, an Essex-class carrier laid down in 1943, was pulled from reserve at the New York Naval Shipyard in September 1952 and given a genuine angled deck, not painted lines but relocated arrestor gear and a widened port sponson. She was recommissioned in January 1953 with a landing area angled 10.5 degrees off centerline. Trials began in the Atlantic that same month. Captain S.G. Mitchell reported to the Bureau of Aeronautics in February 1953 that Antietam had conducted 4,000 landings in her first 3 months with a single serious incident. The Bureau's own statisticians compared this against the previous year's fleet average and produced a figure that circulated through the Pentagon. Accident rates had fallen by approximately 50%. The Foreign Office followed the American reaction with careful attention. Sir Roger Mackins, the British ambassador in Washington, cabled the Foreign Secretary Anthony Eden in April 1953 that the US Navy was treating the angled deck as a matter of national urgency, and that Admiral Robert Carney, Chief of Naval Operations, had ordered the modification of every operational Essex-class carrier as a priority conversion. 15 ships. The program became known as SCB-125. It ran alongside SCB-27C, the steam catapult modification, which was also British, invented by Commander Colin Mitchell of the Royal Navy Reserve, trialled aboard HMS Perseus in 1951, and licensed to the Americans in 1952. 2 revolutions in carrier aviation, both British, both moving west across the Atlantic within 18 months of each other. Mitchell's steam catapult story ran in parallel. Perseus arrived at Philadelphia Navy Yard in February 1952 for demonstrations to the US Navy. The Americans watched a Grumman Panther launched from a stationary carrier by British Steam and immediately requested licensing terms. Within weeks, the BXS-1 catapult on Perseus was being copied as the C-11. The combination of steam catapult and angled deck, the two together, made the modern jet carrier possible. Neither had been American in origin. Both were operational American technology by 1955. The Cabinet Defense Committee discussed the licensing arrangements in July 1953. Lord Cherwell, the Paymaster General, argued for extracting royalties commensurate with the strategic value transferred. The First Lord of the Admiralty, J.P.L. Thomas, took the opposite view, that the alliance mattered more than the fees and that antagonizing the Americans over technology sharing at the height of the Korean War was politically impossible. Britain took modest royalties. The Americans built dozens of carriers, the Royal Navy built 4. The disproportion would define the next 30 years of British naval aviation. The question was no longer whether the ideas were British. The question was whether Britain could still afford to use them. The Ark Royal problem sat on Anthony Eden's desk in early 1955. The new carrier had commissioned in February with an interim angled deck of only 5.5 degrees, insufficient for the coming generation of jets, but the ship had been too far along in construction to modify further. Her sister HMS Eagle had none at all in her original configuration. The Admiralty's Director of Naval Construction, Sir Alfred Sims, submitted a paper to the board in March 1955, recommending that both ships be taken in hand for full conversion at the earliest budgetary opportunity. The cost, he estimated, was £15 million per ship. The Treasury's response, filed by Sir Edward Bridges as Permanent Secretary, was that the money did not exist. The Suez Crisis of 1956 threw the argument into sharp relief. HMS Eagle, HMS Albion, and HMS Bulwark all took part in Operation Musketeer that November, flying Seahawks and Sea Venoms against Egyptian airfields at Al-Mazar, Cairo West, and Inchas. Eagle still had her original straight deck. Her landing operations were slow, her sortie generation constrained, and Rear Admiral Dennis Lambert, commanding the carrier force, complained in his post-operation report that the ship's inability to launch and recover simultaneously had cost the task group tactical flexibility during the most intensive phases of air operations. The document, held at the National Archives at Kew under ADM 116, reads with a controlled frustration. Eagle was, in his phrase, operating below her potential class capability. Suez collapsed politically in November 1956 under American financial pressure. The strategic humiliation was total. Harold Macmillan, becoming Prime Minister in January 1957, ordered a defence review under Duncan Sandys that would reshape the Royal Navy's assumptions about carrier aviation for a generation. The Sandys White Paper of April 1957 famously argued that the era of manned aircraft was ending, and that guided missiles would replace them. The Fleet Air Arm survived the paper largely because the first Sea Lord, Admiral of the Fleet, Earl Mountbatten of Burma, fought a rearguard action through the Chiefs of Staff Committee that has been documented by Peter Hennessy in his work on the machinery of British defence policy. Mountbatten kept the carriers. He could not keep them modern indefinitely. Ark Royal went into refit at Devonport in 1959 for a full angled deck conversion to 8.5 degrees. Eagle followed at Devonport between 1959 and 1964, emerging with a proper angled deck, mirror landing sight, and updated arrestor gear. The mirror sight itself was another British invention. Nicholas Goodhart's optical landing system, developed at the Royal Aircraft Establishment in 1952, adopted by the US Navy in 1955. Three fundamental technologies of jet carrier operation: angled deck, steam catapult, mirror landing sight. All British, all now standard equipment on American supercarriers, displacing 4 times the tonnage of anything in the Royal Navy's inventory. Cambell, promoted to Rear Admiral and appointed Flag Officer Air, home in 1960, watched the transformation with a specific bitterness that emerged only later, in interviews given to naval historians in the 1970s. He observed that Britain had provided the intellectual capital of the modern carrier navy, and had been unable to convert that capital into strategic weight. The angled deck, in his phrase, had been our best idea and our worst bargain. The next test would come in a form no one at the Admiralty had planned for. The Americans wanted more. The technical exchanges of the mid-1950s were formalized through the Mutual Weapons Development Program, and beneath that umbrella, the angled deck concept generated a stream of subsidiary technologies that flowed continuously from the Royal Aircraft Establishment and the Admiralty Experimental Works at Haslar into American naval aviation. The deck landing projector sight, the mirror landing sight, the steam catapult accumulator systems, the deck edge lift arrangements adopted on later Essex conversions, all had British antecedents. The naval attaché in Washington, Captain Peter Dickens, reported to the Admiralty in 1957 that the American technical mission to Farnborough had, in its own internal assessment, described British naval aviation research as at least 3 years ahead of comparable US programs. The strategic irony was that the Americans were now using British ideas to build a navy Britain could not match. USS Forrestal, commissioned in October 1955, was the first American carrier designed from the keel up around the angled deck, steam catapult and mirror sight. She displaced 60,000 tons. Ark Royal displaced 43,000. Forrestal carried 90 aircraft, Ark Royal 40. The disparity was not simply industrial, it was doctrinal. The Americans had internalized the British innovations and scaled them into a global instrument of power projection. Britain had invented the technology and inherited the smaller ships. The exchanges became more difficult in the late 1950s as the two navies diverged on nuclear strategy. The Royal Navy under Mountbatten was committing to Polaris. The agreement signed at Nassau in December 1962 between Macmillan and President Kennedy, and the Fleet Air Arms carrier role was increasingly subordinated to the strategic deterrent. American carrier design, meanwhile, had grown to the Enterprise class. USS Enterprise, commissioned in November 1961 at 93,000 tons, incorporated every British innovation in flight deck engineering and added nuclear propulsion the Royal Navy could not afford to develop for surface ships. The angled deck had become an American signature. The Foreign Office grew concerned about the pattern. A JIC assessment circulated in July 1961, later declassified and held at Q under CAB 158, noted that the technology transfer relationship with the United States had become structurally asymmetric. British innovations flowed west without commensurate returns. The paper singled out naval aviation as the clearest example. The Americans had, by 1961, more angled deck carriers than the entire NATO alliance combined, and Britain retained no realistic prospect of building a comparable class. The Ministry of Defence, formed in its consolidated form in 1964 under Dennis Healey, would inherit the problem. Healey's 1966 Defence Review terminated the CVA-01 programme. The planned replacement carrier that would have incorporated a British-designed angled deck of substantially improved configuration, angled at 9 degrees with a distinctive Alaskan Highway parking arrangement to port. The decision, announced on February 22, 1966, provoked the resignation of the Minister for the Royal Navy, Christopher Mayhew, and the First Sea Lord, Admiral Sir David Luce. Both men argued in Cabinet that the Royal Navy was being asked to abandon capabilities it had itself invented. Healey held firm. The reasoning was fiscal, not technical. Britain, he told the Commons on February 22, 1966, could not sustain a carrier force of the required scale east of Suez against the wider costs of the Strategic Nuclear Deterrent, BAOR commitments, and the Sterling crisis. The last conventional carrier, Ark Royal, would soldier on through the 1970s with Phantoms and Buccaneers, but the strategic decision had been taken. The angled deck, that piece of geometric intuition Cambell had drawn in 1951, had by 1966 become inseparable from a class of ship Britain would no longer build. The Americans, meanwhile, were laying down the first of the Nimitz class. Farnborough in the early 1960s remained a curious institution, a technical laboratory whose intellectual output was disproportionate to its funding and whose innovations continued to seed foreign programs decades after they had ceased to shape British ones. Lewis Boddington, who had worked alongside Cambell on the original angled deck proposal, remained at the Royal Aircraft Establishment and turned his attention to what would eventually become the ski jump ramp. The mathematical work on inclined takeoff runs began in 1968, under a small team including Lieutenant Commander Doug Taylor, who submitted a doctoral thesis to Southampton University in 1973, arguing that an upward inclined ramp could substantially increase the payload of a Harrier launching from a short deck. The paper was not immediately taken seriously. The Ministry of Defence had committed by 1966 to a class of vessel known internally as the through-deck cruiser, a designation contrived, historians including Eric Grove have noted, to obscure from the Treasury and from Parliament that the ships were, functionally, small aircraft carriers. HMS Invincible was ordered in April 1973. HMS Illustrious and HMS Ark Royal followed. The class was designed around the Sea Harrier, the naval version of the Hawker Siddeley Harrier, which the Royal Navy had authorised in 1975 after protracted argument within the Fleet Air Arm about whether a subsonic vertical landing aircraft could substitute for the Phantoms being retired with the old Ark Royal. Taylor's ski jump work was incorporated into HMS Invincible during construction. The ramp inclined at 7 degrees. HMS Hermes, converted for Harrier operations in 1980, received a 12-degree ramp. The physics were straightforward. A Harrier launching from a flat deck traded thrust vector for lift and could carry roughly 3,000 pounds of external stores. The same aircraft launching from a 12-degree ramp could carry closer to 5,000 pounds. The angled deck had solved the recovery problem. The ski jump solved the launch problem for a class of aircraft the Americans did not operate. Argentina invaded the Falkland Islands on April 2, 1982. The War Cabinet convened at Downing Street under Margaret Thatcher within hours. The First Sea Lord, Admiral Sir Henry Leach, arrived in full uniform on the evening of March 31st, before the invasion had even formally begun, and told the Prime Minister that a task force could be at sea within 72 hours. Leach's confidence rested on Invincible and Hermes, two ships that could not have existed in operational form without the ski jump ramp, without the Sea Harrier, without the chain of technical decisions running back through Boddington and Cambell to the Admiralty in 1951. The task force sailed from Portsmouth on April 5th. 28 Sea Harriers of 800, 801 and 809 Naval Air Squadrons embarked between them across the two carriers. The aircraft would fly 1,435 combat sorties over the following 10 weeks, claim 21 Argentine aircraft in air combat for no losses in air-to-air engagements, and lose 6 of their own number to ground fire, accidents and weather. The angled deck and ski jump combination, Britain's own contribution to Carrier Aviation, half of it exported to the Americans a generation earlier, proved itself in the South Atlantic under conditions the designers had never anticipated. The Americans watched carefully. The US Marine Corps, operating AV-8 Harriers of its own, had adopted the aircraft in 1971, but had not built ski jumps into its amphibious ships. After the Falklands, Marine Corps studies at Patuxent River in 1983 confirmed the payload advantages Taylor had calculated a decade earlier. The next chapter of the story was about to reverse direction. The Falklands Operational Analysis was assembled at Northwood by the Fleet Air Arms Directorate of Naval Air Warfare during the summer and autumn of 1982. Captain Lynn Middleton, commanding officer of HMS Hermes, submitted his report on the ship's performance in September. The document, released to the National Archives in 2012 and held under ADM 202, records that the ski jump ramp had allowed Sea Harriers to launch in sea states and cross-deck winds that would have grounded a conventional catapult operation. The ramp, in Middleton's assessment, had converted a marginal aircraft into a viable interceptor. The Sea Harrier's combat radius was limited, its weapons load small, its radar the Blue Fox of modest capability, but the ramp had given it enough performance margin to operate in the South Atlantic in winter. The US Marine Corps requested formal access to the Farnborough ski jump data in 1983. The technical files held under restricted classification at the Royal Aircraft Establishment were shared under the standing UK-US Technology Exchange Agreements. The Marines constructed a test ramp at Patuxent River Naval Air Station in Maryland and conducted trials with AV-8A and AV-8B Harriers through 1983 and 1984. The results confirmed Taylor's original calculations. Payload increases of between 30 and 50% were achievable depending on ramp angle. The Wasp-class amphibious assault ships, the first of which was laid down in 1985, were designed with the intention of future ski jump installation, though the ramps were never fitted for reasons connected to helicopter operations and hangar arrangements. The intellectual debt was nonetheless direct. Spain, Italy, India, Thailand, and eventually Australia acquired ships incorporating British-designed ski jump ramps between 1983 and the early 1990s. The Príncipe de Asturias, commissioned into the Spanish Navy in May 1988, incorporated a 12-degree ramp of essentially British design. The Italian Giuseppe Garibaldi, commissioned in 1985, followed a similar pattern. The Indian INS Virat was the former HMS Hermes herself, sold to India in 1986 and operating with her original ski jump into the 21st century. British naval aviation technology, unable to reproduce itself at home in ships of significant scale, had become the standard architecture for a global class of light carriers. The Ministry of Defence in the 1980s under Michael Heseltine and later George Younger continued to review the balance of the surface fleet. The Knott Review of 1981, Sir John Knott's command, paper 8288, The Way Forward, had proposed the sale of Invincible to Australia and substantial reductions in the escort force. The Falklands Campaign, which began 10 months after the paper was published, invalidated the strategic assumptions on which the review had rested. Invincible remained in Royal Navy service. The through-deck cruiser concept, born of budgetary evasion, had produced ships that would remain the core of British carrier aviation for another 25 years. The Cold War entered its final phase with the Royal Navy operating 3 ships whose flight deck architecture, angled landing area, ski jump, mirror landing site, traced directly to work done at Farnborough between 1951 and 1973. The Americans, meanwhile, were operating 14 supercarriers of the Forrestal, Kitty Hawk, Enterprise and Nimitz classes, every one of which incorporated 3 foundational technologies that had originated in British research establishments. Ronald Reagan's 600-ship Navy, announced in 1981 and largely realized by 1988, was in its flight deck engineering an American translation of British ideas at a scale Britain had never been able to match. The intellectual return to Britain took an unexpected form in the closing years of the Cold War. The reverse technology flow began in the mid-1980s and centered, unexpectedly, on operational doctrine rather than hardware. The US Navy Fighter Weapons School at NAS Miramar, the Top Gun program, had developed dissimilar air combat training methods that the Fleet Air Arm sent officers to observe from 1983 onwards. Lieutenant Commander Sharkey Ward, who had commanded 801 Naval Air Squadron on Invincible during the Falklands, participated in exchanges that brought American combat methodology into Sea Harrier operations. The technical direction had reversed. The British had exported the platform architecture. The Americans, having built the world's largest carrier air arm around it, had generated tactical innovations that flowed back east. The intelligence relationship remained the deeper channel. GCHQ at Cheltenham and the National Security Agency at Fort Meade shared signals intelligence on Soviet naval aviation continuously through the 1980s under the UK-USA arrangements dating from 1946. The Soviet Kiev-class carriers, Kyiv, Minsk, Novorossiysk and Baku, were assessed jointly by the Joint Intelligence Committee and the American intelligence community. The JIC's Naval Working Party, meeting quarterly at the Cabinet Office, produced assessments in 1985 and 1986 that noted the Soviets were developing an angled deck conventional carrier of their own. The ship that would become the Admiral Kuznetsov, laid down at Nikolaev in 1983. Soviet naval aviation was, in the words of one JIC assessment, approaching the state of the art of 1955, 30 years behind and closing. The Kuznetsov class was significant because it incorporated a ski jump ramp, the first Soviet carrier to do so. Boddington's mathematical work, transmitted through the Farnborough exchanges to the Americans, had by the mid-1980s propagated globally to the point where the Soviet Union was building it into its own capital ships. The technology transfer routes to Moscow remain contested among historians. Christopher Andrews' Authorized History of MI5 records that considerable Soviet intelligence effort was expended on Western carrier design throughout the 1970s and 1980s, and the KGB's Line X, scientific and technical intelligence, regarded naval aviation as a priority collection target. The Kuznetsov commissioned in December 1990, a year before the Soviet Union itself dissolved. She was, in her flight deck architecture, a Soviet interpretation of a British idea filtered through American implementation. The angled landing area was there. The ski jump was there. The mirror landing site, evolved into the Soviet lunar system, was there. Cambell, who died in 2000, lived to see the final vindication of the geometric insight he had first sketched on a table at the Admiralty in 1951. Every operational fixed-wing aircraft carrier in the world by 1991 incorporated his design. The strategic accounting was less flattering to Britain. The Royal Navy in 1991 operated 3 Invincible-class carriers of 20,000 tons apiece, each embarking approximately 8 Sea Harriers and 12 helicopters. The United States Navy operated 15 supercarriers, each embarking approximately 80 aircraft, each incorporating the British trinity of angled deck, steam catapult, and mirror landing site, plus the American additions of nuclear propulsion and dedicated air wings. The ratio of British to American carrier aviation capacity, measured in embarked aircraft, was approximately 1:50. The intellectual origin of the technology had ceased to translate into strategic weight decades earlier. The final question was not whether Britain had invented the modern carrier. The question was what a great naval power did after it had ceased to be one. Dennis Cambell was interviewed at his home in Hampshire in 1992 by the naval historian Norman Friedman, whose subsequent work, British Carrier Aviation, incorporated much of the exchange. Cambell was in his 80s by then. He recalled the meeting in August 1951 with clarity. The wooden model, the rotation of the flight deck, the initial skepticism of the officers around the table. He remembered particularly the response of Rear Admiral Slattery, who had grasped the implications immediately and had championed the concept to the Admiralty Board within days. Cambell was asked whether he felt any resentment about the American exploitation of the idea. He said he did not. The alliance had needed it. The technology had saved pilots' lives on both sides of the Atlantic. That, he said, was the account he chose to keep. The historical record permits a more equivocal reading. Peter Hennessy has argued that the pattern established by the angled deck transfer, British intellectual innovation, American industrial exploitation, British inability to sustain equivalent capability, became characteristic of the Cold War Anglo-American defense relationship across multiple technologies. The steam catapult followed the same trajectory. The mirror landing site followed it. Chobhamama, developed at the Fighting Vehicles Research and Development Establishment in Surrey in the 1960s, would follow it into the Abrams tank. The Harrier itself, though produced in modified form by McDonnell Douglas as the AV-8B, followed a version of the pattern. The relationship was, in Hennessy's phrase in The Secret State, an asymmetric exchange that Britain accepted for reasons of alliance politics, rather than commercial or strategic advantage. The Cold War ended for the Royal Navy in a state that reflected the accumulated consequences of the pattern. The 1990 Options for Change Review, published under Tom King as Secretary of State for Defense in July 1990, reduced the frigate and destroyer force from 50 ships to 40, and confirmed the eventual retirement of the last conventional carrier capabilities. The Invincible class continued. The Sea Harrier was upgraded to FA2 configuration in the mid-1990s. The essential architecture, angled deck, ski jump, vertical landing aircraft, remained the pattern of British naval aviation until HMS Illustrious decommissioned in 2014. The Queen Elizabeth class, ordered in 2007 and entering service from 2017, represents the 21st century return of the large carrier to the Royal Navy. Both HMS Queen Elizabeth and HMS Prince of Wales incorporate ski jump ramps at 12 degrees, embark the F-35B Lightning II, and displace 65,000 tons apiece. They are, in their flight deck architecture, direct descendants of Campbell's 1951 sketch, Boddington's Farnborough calculations, and Taylor's 1973 doctoral thesis. The ships are not, however, angled deck carriers in the classical sense. The vertical landing capability of the F-35B has made the angled deck unnecessary. The technology has looped back on itself. Campbell's paper of November 1951 remains in the National Archives at Kew under ADM 1/2-4030. The document is unremarkable in appearance, typescript sketches, some pencil annotations by senior officers. It is arguably the single most consequential piece of naval engineering documentation produced in Britain during the Cold War. Every carrier in every navy that operates fixed-wing aircraft from a moving deck at sea does so on principles articulated in that paper. The strategic power that followed from the idea did not in the end remain in British hands. The idea itself did.